There is in Washington today an ominous echo of a debate in Britain 50 years ago. Then, as today, an economic slump had depressed government revenues while making social spending all the more urgent. Then, as today, there was a broad consensus for cutting defense. But one stubborn man objected. He was considered intellectually shallow because he kept citing the menace of a great power to the east. He was ridiculed as too old and nostalgic for a simpler age. He was criticized as a scaremonger whose alarms impeded arms control. This stubborn man was Winston Churchill. U.S. policy since the 60s has resembled British policy in the 30s. British policy, set by Churchill's critics, first pledged to maintain British superiority. Then it pledged to maintain parity. Then it insisted that Germany's numerical superiority did not really mean British inferiority. Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer said, "Economic vigor, a balanced budget, is more important than preparedness." The Chancellor was Neville Chamberlain. The result was a Britain prepared only for his policy of appeasement. British policy said to Germany what deep cuts in the U.S. defense budget would say to the Soviet Union. The message was, we are desperate for an arms agreement because we cannot afford to match your spending. But desperation is no basis for negotiation. Churchill's critics wanted to trust Britain's safety to arms control, not because arms control had ever worked or was apt to tame Germany, but because it would be cheap. A buildup sufficient to deter Germany would cost money, but it would not have cost nearly as much as the war did cost. Churchill's position then, like Reagan's today, is that we can afford what we need. What we cannot afford is to allow budgetary convenience to control security policy. We cannot afford wishful thinking that says we need only what is painless to provide. Leadership is getting people to do what they would rather not do, but what prudence demands. That is why democracies clamor for leadership only until someone actually tries it. Today, Washington is full of politicians clamoring against the Secretary of Defense, Cap Weinberger. They say he is stubborn, but stubbornness is his duty. He has the responsibility of deciding what security requires and saying it stubbornly. No sane person enjoys military spending. That is why politicians with their ears to the ground rarely hear public support for adequate defense spending. But as Churchill said of politicians who keep their ears to the ground, it is hard to look up to someone in that position. This is George Will for Nightline.
I don't think it means a policy shift. I think we generally tend to read mind and policy into government more often than it is really there. I think there's a lot of personality difficulty here, a difference of tactics and almost protocol about how to deal with the Russians. But manifestly, the president is, as he said on Friday, sticking with, in the theater nuclear force question, the zero option. And the White House remains convinced, the Pentagon remains convinced, I hope the State Department remains convinced, that you cannot probably have a real breakthrough in arms control until we approach or reach December and show to the Soviet Union that we can indeed deploy the Pershings and the ground-launched cruise missiles. That is the leverage the president was talking about.
And I understand that Schultz feels very strongly that March 6th is a critical date, which is the date of the West German elections, and that Kohl, if he is to survive in these elections, is going to have to be given something to demonstrate that the United States is indeed prepared not to follow a completely obdurate, hardline policy in dealing with arms control.
Look at what we're supposed to do now. It's the United States, while the Soviet Union races ahead deploying missiles targeted at Germany, the United States is supposed to show flexibility in a program that is the maximum disarmament position. We are now in our second decade of arms control talks. That span, going back to about 1969, has coincided with the most rapid buildup of strategic forces the world has ever seen. It is very important, if the president is not to throw away the leverage he rightly wants, that he say, convincingly perhaps, to the Europeans that arms control is the most important business of this generation, but that he not believe it. And that the Soviet Union know that he not believe it. Because once you become desperate for arms control agreements, you lose your leverage. There is no public pressure, no demonstrations in Gorky Park pressing the Kremlin toward arms control.
Elizabeth, Do you see anything constructive coming out of this, George?
I think if Mr. Bush gets back without causing a calamity, and I'm not reflecting poorly on Bush, but on the mission he's been given.
Well, the mission or the policy?
The mission, which is to go to Europe on the eve of the German election, when our only particularly staunch advocate of the president's program is the socialist president of France, which is barely in NATO, barely associated with NATO in any way, in fact, technically out of it, is asking George Bush to go over there in an extremely vexed and turbulent time, and to, on the one hand, show flexibility without, on the other hand, deviating at all from the president's program.
Well,
I don't see how you square that
you.
circle that's sending Bush over, if, and I don't think this is part of his mission, were he to go there and show, as you call it, flexibility, he'd be sawing the limb off. He'd be sawing off the limb on which Mr. Cole sits, because Mr. Cole has been very staunch. Paul, at this point, is not trying to get an arms control agreement. There's no reason why he should try to negotiate something that the German electorate could hand him on a platter, which is a unilateral disruption of American deployments. It's a standard Soviet use of arms control talks to disrupt Western procurements, period. You'll yield precious little. The president knows that in the 1970s, domestic spending increased in real terms about 95%. Defense spending declined in real terms by 8%. Now, along comes the Reagan administration with a mandate from the last election and says we're going to increase, you can argue about what it is, about 10% in 1984. And the likes of Don Regal, a senator from Michigan, who was a fanatic, if ever there was one, for domestic spending, goes on television and calls this partial correction of a decade-long neglect fanaticism. And it just seems to me that it's very hard, once they get past the posturing for the evening news and get down to actually cutting, exempting, of course, all bases in their districts and all procurements made in their districts or near their districts, it's going to be very hard for them to make good on this.
Well,
a moment ago about being responsive, being political.
Yeah.
I just think the public ought to bear this in mind. There's an almost unanimous desire in Congress to cut the defense budget.
Right.
That tells you, it may be right substantively, but it certainly tells you where the political reward is right now. There's a clear, immediate political payoff in cutting the defense budget.
Well, it's a $245 billion target, George.
And I think those who stand at any time on any subject against as clear a national consensus and as clear a political reward as the President and Cap Weinberger are doing have a certain momentum for respect in their arguments.
Yep.
Because they're paying a price to do something they think's right. It's called leadership, and it makes people think they're paranoid.
But
it is always comforting to say, and certainly the wish can be the father to the thought, that, well, we'll be strong enough if we have full employment or better roads or good morale or what have you. In the end, deterrence has been, for 30 years, a function of military hardware and adequate military preparation.
I do,
the way
yeah.
this gets argued about.
Yeah.
Alan Cranston gives a speech in which he says the number 1.6 trillion, which is what the president asked for before he cut his request. 1.6 trillion is an incomprehensible figure, his words. Well, it gets comprehensible if you think of it as $1.1 billion less, 40% less than we're going to spend on domestic programs over the same period.
Kenneth Adelman, nominated by the President to be Director of Nuclear Arms Control and Disarmament, replacing Mr. Rostow, who was dismissed, testified last week before Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He couldn't answer a lot of very basic questions. Could nuclear war be limited? Could you win a nuclear war, etc.?
Who
Big
can?
question.
Can nuclear war be
Well,
limited,
all
Martin?
right, hold it.
Wait,
Tell us, Martin. Let me get the answer from Martin. Can nuclear war be limited, Martin?
I think not.
Are you sure?
Sure, you can be sure.
All right.
All right.
But that isn't the way he asked.
Go ahead.
He didn't say I
He
don't
said-
know.
he
said
said
I
he
don't
had-
have any serious views on that.
He said, I had no thoughts in that area, which was his answer, George.
Okay.
I think that's most unresponsive.
He was
and I
asked-
think it demonstrates a mindset that rather distresses me in a man who's going to be in control of nuclear arms and disarmament.
It demonstrates that his mind is not set.
Yeah.
Well, calm.
He was asked
All right,
80s.
now-
He was asked.
all right, wait a
questions
minute.
in
You can
86.
defend him. I'm really raised the point. Who wants to defend
I
him
do.
first? Go ahead, George. Yeah.
And about 86 subjects he was asked questions. And 8 of them, he said
Yeah.
the unforgivable 4 words. He says, I don't know. Now, not everybody's as smart as journalists. We know everything about everything. What Mr. Adelman really was saying, and he should have picked the other word, he said it is unknowable. We actually don't know whether you can have limited nuclear wars, and we hope to never find out. But the fact of the matter is, senators, of course, being almost as smart as journalists, know everything too, and so they work themselves into a very pretty lather over the fact that someone had the temerity to come before the Senate and say there are lots of unknowable things in the world.
He was asked how he would deal with a verified Soviet offer to do away with all nuclear weapons. This was last week, to which he responded last week, I have never in my life contemplated how I would deal with such an offer.
Let me tell you exactly what was going on.
Well, listen, I'm quoting what the man said.
I'm trying to explain. I've read the entire transcript.
Go, George.
Jesse Helms, that noted strategic thinker, asked him a question, what would you say if the Soviet Union offered a verifiable agreement to ban all nuclear weapons? Now, Adelman, having an orderly mind, thinks all includes the British, the French, they're sovereign nations. Last time I saw, it's not clear how the United States negotiates them away. Second, it is such a wildly implausible hypothesis. Khrushchev used to say, what if a shrimp could whistle? Well, what if? The fact of the matter is, Adelman, being an intelligent person, doesn't sit around contemplating wildly improbable hypotheticals like that. Before flying off to make of himself a gift to the people of New Hampshire, Alan Cranston accused Ken Adelman of saying it would be helpful to the United States were South Africa to use nuclear weapons against its blacks or against neighboring blacks. That's a recklessness unseen in the Senate since Joe McCarthy.
Well, he never said such a thing.
Adelman never said it.
Adelman never said it.
Of course he didn't say such a thing.
Cranston.
Where in the world would Cranston come at a thing like that?
From a study, a perfectly responsible, temperate study Adelman wrote for the Stanford Research Institute. Under pressure from Doves and peace groups, the president has retreated from a zero option, which is too bad. But in doing so, he has put the ball in the Soviet court. He has said, pick a number, any number. I picked the number 0. You didn't like that. Pick a number. And now it's up to them to see whether they are interested in a serious negotiation. I'd like to have seen the Western world stick by this longer until we made clear who it was opposed to ridding Europe of a certain category of weapon. But leaving that aside, the president has made a timing judgment, and it's a very shrewd proposal he has made, because he has said to them, pick any number you want. Bear in mind, Martin, that already the Soviet Union has deployed on its SS-20s in Europe approximately twice as many warheads as the United States proposes to deploy if it goes to its full deployment. The president has now challenged them to pick a number, and I think the result will be that the Soviet Union will stand forth before the world revealed as really not being very interested in an agreement.
George a question.
How do you feel?
Well, I'm not hopeful either, and I'll make a melancholy prediction. The reason I'm not hopeful is the Soviet Union knows full well our propensity to negotiate with ourselves. The president was accused of not being flexible, so now he's flexible and he's off the zero option. In 3 months, there'll be a chorus throughout the country from the same old people saying, well, now we should name a number. And after we've named a number, there will be a chorus 3 months after that for the president to get off the principle of equality of warheads or to count Allies' weapon systems. And the Soviet Union can, I'm afraid, count on. This is, as Hugh says, the asymmetry of the pressures that affect this negotiation. Not the point. The point is that I cannot believe the president meant to endorse the principle and the logic that's implied in the statement he gave at that press conference, because what he said was, Israel cannot be given weapons for aggressive use as long as they are in Lebanon. They are in Lebanon as aggressors, he seemed to be saying, and that therefore any weapons given to them as long as they are in Lebanon will be for aggressive purposes, and therefore, as long as they're in Lebanon, we cannot supply them arms. There are 2 points about this. This is entirely unilateral pressure. None comparable can be brought by us on the Syrians to get out. They have 35,000 troops there. But more to the point, it seems to me it is now in the interest, if that is the principle the president has endorsed, it is now in the interests of the Arab world, of Israel's enemies, to keep Israel in southern Lebanon, because it is then has no access to American arms and will be steadily disarmed over the years. That's why I'm saying that by tying it to this law, it seems to me he endorsed a much more sweeping, radical, and dangerous principle than he could clearly have intended to. Because the Congress is acting not on the basis of a reasonable assessment of the Soviet threat, but rather simply from political convenience, the president will not get the 10% that he has asked for and the country needs. We have to make some distinctions here. In the first place, the president, in a way, has won a great victory. When the liberal Democratic position is a 4 or 5% real increase in defense, 6 years ago, the Democratic Party elected a president committed to, I believe it was a 7% cut in defense. So you have a broad consensus that this president is in no small measure responsible for building, that the country needs real increases in defense. Now, one thing Charles Grassley is not doing is ruining his eyesight reading Soviet military doctrine and other matter. I just don't believe that. The really serious members up there, whose judgment you have to respect, a man like Domenici, is confronted with a terrible problem, and that is that we have the deficits that Carl is now worried about, and we simply don't have a revenue base in the federal government sufficient for closing the deficits and rearming the country. But if you begin from the position that I do, that this country can afford what it needs, then you come back to the position with which I have plied and belabored, not to mention bored you for 2 years, which is that it's time for us to find some new revenue sources to pay for what we need.
You would be your answer.
If anything, I think Weinberger has understated our needs.
Yeah,
well, I mean, the Sandinistas have set up a Stalinist dictatorship, and they've said we have passed through, you may not have noticed it, it's like driving through a very small town very fast, we have passed through the elections stage of our democratic revolution. So they're going to get people trying to shoot back at them, and I think that if they get overthrown, that would certainly be a blessing to the hemisphere. But there's a curious, you want to talk about morality and consistency and argument. When the left tries to shoot its way into power, start shooting in El Salvador, people say, wait, we must have 6 elections and then we must negotiate and share power. That's what the world opinion is. Now, I would like to hear world opinion, so-called, now say to the Sandinistas, well, you obviously have a disaffected minority, maybe a disaffected majority, you better have some elections and share power. Let's hear that from the United Nations.
Hear it from the United States. No one would object to that.
Why
do you raise it, George?
We
I mean, you think it's impossible for us to do that?
We are constantly urging the Sandinistas to have elections as they promised to do. Let's hear the United Nations pause in its sanctimony long enough to say that. The administration really had no choice. The president said he'd adopt her before sending her back, which is wonderful. But sending her back was never an option. She had an absolute right to apply for asylum. She fulfilled the criterion, that is, she had a well-founded fear of persecution if she went home. The people in the State Department, whose profession is to please China, didn't want to do this because to grant her political asylum offends China in 2 ways. A, it was saying that they were not telling the truth when they promised not to persecute her. And B, it is a clear comment on the severe totalitarianism of their regime. And therefore, it's really the very fact that it is offensive to Peking makes it encouraging that we did it, because for several years we seemed incapable of doing anything offensive to Peking, and therefore it's quite welcome, and as I say, we really had no choice. Irritated because of 10,000 Chinese in this country, 1,000, 1 in 10 have applied for asylum, and they have to face the fact that they're going to lose about 1 in 10 people to a better society. I do not see how you can say that this administration, which has, in my judgment, violated the Taiwan Relations Act by pledging to satisfy Peking by phasing out arms sales to Taiwan, has undermined the Shanghai Accord. That contrary to the civics textbooks, we don't have 3 branches of government, we have 4. You have the legislative, executive, judicial, and Alan Greenspan. You wait until you get a crisis, as in Social Security, a crisis with a real bottom line, that is, we're running out of money and there's a trust fund and all that. Then you get Alan Greenspan, and you get some other people from both parties and some people from outside of government. You go around on Sunday mornings to Blair House and to Jim Baker's house, and you solve a problem that the legislature can't come to grips with.
Other people budget and the huge deficit in it, and deciding what we might. But Mr. Reagan says no taxes, and other people say that's the way to correct the deficit.
But Sam, look what they did. They voted for 3 years to increase taxes $73 billion. But they shot the arrow in the air and didn't care where it came down. That is to say, they said, we're for a number, 73. You, Dole, you, someone else, figure out how to do it. So it really is striking a pose more than governing. I think it's very good for a Syrian pullback. In the first place, the Soviet forces don't want them to pull back. Sadat was strong enough to expel the Soviet forces. It's not clear that Assad is. Assad is a minority representative of a constituency in his own country. Therefore, he takes an extreme Syrian nationalist view. Greater Syria is said to include a good chunk of Lebanon, sometimes Haifa and other northern Israeli places. So it's not clear to me that he could, if he wanted to, or that there's any reason for him to want to. America has ended in the Middle East. It lasted roughly from 73 with the ascendancy of the oil weapon through 82 with the collapse of oil prices and the exhaustion of the military option on the part of the Arab powers. The fact is, the siege of Beirut was the siege by Israel of an Arab capital, and not one Arab nation did anything about it.
What does that lead to?
So the forces on the ground dictate diplomacy. Diplomacy doesn't dictate facts. The facts are that Israel is militarily predominant. Jordan doesn't seem to want the West Bank, even if Israel wanted to negotiate it away. You're going to have a messy situation, but I think for 10 or 15 years, a messy situation much resembling the situation today. I don't see another war. It seems to me that the Egyptian regime of whatever stripe can offer rhetorical complaint about the status of the West Bank, but the Egyptians are tired of dying for abstractions and Palestinians and Jordanians. I do not think they're going to go back to the war path.
Mr. Reagan's idea.
Isn't it his prerogative?
All right,
Look,
go ahead, George.
these people that he's appointed all are grown-up people, and they have a history, and the history shows that they have been very sympathetic to civil rights causes and movements. There is an argument in this country about what constitutes fidelity to the core values of the civil rights movement and impulse in this country.
And what will work?
And what will work. And there are those who say we are tending away from, not toward, a colorblind legal system, which is what we want. And busing is inefficient, divisive, increases the saliency of racial differences in the country, and should be abandoned in favor of other efforts. This is a fairly mild, modest difference of opinion, and it does a severe injustice to three good people to imply that these people are hostile to civil rights. Well, the military case, the strictly military argument for the MX, is relatively weak. This is not the best way to spend $26 billion for defense.
Well, it's an interesting admission, George.
Well, I've said it before on the Agronsky show.
Go ahead.
But the fact remains that there is some hope that this will move, not Ronald Reagan to negotiate, Ronald Reagan's negotiating, but that this will convince the Soviet negotiators that we will not make unilateral concessions, and that if they want to put limits on the arms race, they have to be mutual limits. That's the constitutional amendment. I think that right to unlimited abortion on demand was established by judicial fiat in 1973. What they've done now, with all the fine-tuning decisions, is to say that this right, which prior to 1973 no one had discovered at all in the Constitution, is so fundamental that it cannot be in any significant way burdened by any regulation. What the 73 decision is that I think I would disagree with Jack, who says that especially in the third trimester, trimesters being without medical or moral significance, I think are even without legal significance. You say that in the third trimester an abortion under the 73 ruling is well hedged in.
Or it can be prohibited.
It cannot be prohibited in any case where one doctor says that the woman's life or health, including mental health, including distress, is at stake. So what they did in 1973, and I'm convinced the court doesn't understand it yet, was legalized abortion on demand effectively in all three trimesters. The court, in its statement of secular religion in 1973, said at no point in any of the three trimesters is a fetus fully human. Now, let me ask you, just to give you a sense of the intellectual chaos we're now sunk in. The day before the Supreme Court ruled this week, a Los Angeles jury convicted a former sheriff's deputy of murder because during an unauthorized drug raid, he shot a woman who subsequently recovered from the wound but killed the third trimester fetus in her stomach. Now, how do you convict someone of murder for killing something the Supreme Court says is not fully human and indeed has the legal status of a hamburger in that woman's stomach?
Well, but
look at another bizarre circumstance. In this week's decision, there are 1.6 million abortions a year in this country, and that results in a fair number of abortions that don't work. The fetus is born alive. Now, generally, they just kill the fetus with some form of aggressive neglect or suffocation. The Missouri law said you have to have a second physician in attendance in third trimester abortions so that he can attend to the life of a fetus that survives a failed abortion. Now, that's a very peculiar ruling right there in the first place, to say that the state has an interest in this, but the language the Supreme Court uses, they say a fetus born alive has these rights. A fetus born alive in my neighborhood is called a baby, called a child. Why can't they use the language?
Yeah, but
they're talking about
perhaps not capable of survival.
They're talking. This is a post-viability abortion. It's a fetus outside the mother, and the court. Orwell said it well. Insincerity and confusion is the enemy of clear language, and the language in there is appalling.
Baby.
Carl,
I mean, you can't have it both ways.
People, from your point of view, talking the language of free choice, took away by litigation, using judicial power, the freedom of 50 states to choose a different policy
That's
on
the
abortion.
system, Joe.
Not that much.
I really heard Schultz, things in Schultz that I guess you people didn't, in part because I think you don't want to hear them. And that is, Schultz was saying, this distinguishes the Reagan foreign policy not just from Carter, but from the Nixon-Ford foreign policy. He said, détente failed. It did not, as we thought it would, induce changes in Soviet behavior and ultimately in the Soviet system. That we are going to rely for deterrence not just on a web of interdependencies, trade and cultural relations and all the rest, but are going to rely more on Soviet perceptions of credible risks to them from certain kinds of behavior. And I think that's a sharpening of the American position and welcome.
And the remedy being offered by Walter Mondale and several others is more federal money. They're talking of as much as, what is it, $11 billion to start? Additional federal money to start?
The first Mondale bid was $11 billion, and Fritz Hollings saying, gosh, I don't want it to look as though I'm buying votes, but I say $14 billion because we got to give $5,000 raise to every teacher and double that to inner city teachers. Now, the White House is very pleased with the way this has developed so far, because it seems to have triggered a reflex in the Democratic Party to translate every issue into one of money and then to bid against one another to see who can get the highest sum. And the president's line, and it will be this for the rest of this argument, is that this is not a money problem, that the increase that Hodding talks about has correlated exactly with an increased dissatisfaction on the product of the educational system, that it's expectations, values, all kinds of moral intangibles that are the problem, and I think he's finding a resonance for that in the country. We've done nothing to enhance our stockpile, a deteriorating stockpile over time, while the Soviet Union has rushed ahead with this. The Wall Street Journal has documented, I think, beyond peradventure, that they are violating restrictions on chemical and biological warfare with yellow rain in Southeast Asia and in Afghanistan. It has 60,000 to 70,000 soldiers specifically trained for this. Their maneuvers indicate that they have this as a part of their warfighting technique. They have 4 academies devoted to this. It seems to me World War II, when both sides had gas and didn't use it, he indicated that deterrence worked there, and this is a way of strengthening deterrence. And I would point out, by the way, two Democrats, just a second, two Democrats, Glenn and Hollings, voted for proceeding with this, and given the kind of people they're now having to go to solicit votes from, the Democratic activists, that was courageous.
World War, poison gas was used. 100,000 people were killed and 1 million were injured, wounded, probably permanently by poison gas used on the battlefield, including a lot of civilians. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol prohibited the use of that, and people abided by it. Now, why could there not be a similar agreement? Why would you feel that today no side would necessarily be bound to abide by a protocol forbidding its use?
And when
we went through the Second World War, never used it.
When World War II started, they issued the gas mask to the British school children in London. They expected it to happen, and it was not a Geneva Protocol that caused Adolf Hitler, not a scrupulous reader of protocols, to abstain from using this. And it seems to me when we have evidence, I call it incontrovertible, that the Soviet Union is using it now, it seems to me wise to prepare.
Mark, we proceed?
I think he can. I think he has to continue doing what he has been doing, which is making an inherently unpopular case to the American people. And I think you're going to see the rhetoric, some of which we've seen tonight in the film used earlier, is going to get hotter and hotter. You're going to see it argued, as has been argued by one congressman and writing in the New York Times already, that what the Congress did tonight really makes the United States the enforcer of the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine being that the process of becoming a Soviet-Cuban satellite should be irreversible, and the United States now is, in effect, supporting that, according to a good many people on the minority side now in the House of Representatives. The signal is also that the United States, I think Mel is right, has a kind of aesthetic judgment being made here, but also the sense that it would like to believe that wars once started can be ended by other than military means, and I think history doesn't suggest that's very promising. For the word prevail, I'd say achieving a substantial military advantage. I do not believe that foreign policy can be what many Americans want it to be, which is the New Deal carried on by other means. That is, the belief that all political tensions and divisiveness in the world can be tamed and dampened down by economic aid and reform, by material amelioration of living conditions. I just don't believe it. It is arguable, Martin, that had there been timely reforms in Nicaragua or timely reforms in El Salvador, we would not have a Sandinista regime in the latter, or in the former, or a civil war in the latter. But it is too late. there's a war on. And wars, as I understand them, all must end, but they generally end, and negotiations begin only after one side has convinced the other side that its military position is very unpromising.
And we have Castro comes along, who is the co-villain in the piece along with the Soviet Union. And he says, I will take all of my advisors out of Central America.
How many did he say he had?
Something over 200.
Right.
Well, whatever it is.
Okay.
Well, let's just begin with this statement. If the United States will follow suit. Now, let's assume that he's a liar, it's a bluff, he's a hypocrite, whatever you want to assume.
All of that
perfectly
more, yes.
All of that up front.
Right.
But don't you think if it is a bluff, it should be called?
No.
Shouldn't we?
No, not particularly, because,
Why?
look, the reason they do, he says that, and the reason that General Ortega gives the speech he gives in Nicaragua a few days earlier, is the same reason that the Soviet Union devotes 90% of its energies to arms control, and that is it paralyzes our procurement process, it induces irresolution in our policy-making process, it gets Agronsky and Company and other people who should know better sitting around saying, well, gosh, maybe they've changed their spots, when in fact they haven't. That doesn't seem to me they're particularly interested in this. The other side has been rather clear, for example, in El Salvador, about what there is to negotiate about. They want to negotiate power sharing. That is, putting mortal enemies, absolutely incompatible political doctrines in a government together. It's preposterous.
But you were just...
It seems to me that Les is probably right, that the boy probably did write the letters. When the United States government received those letters, it automatically, under its own law, incurred an obligation. And the obligation was to ascertain whether or not this person had a well-founded fear of persecution if he returned to his country. Having written the letter, it seems to me reasonable that he did have a well-founded fear. And it also then had an obligation to find out if he was leaving voluntarily. Now, after 7 days, during which this young person in the Soviet compound was no doubt told interesting lies about how he'll be able to come back and go to college, or will be able to come back here next summer and see Mick Jagger or Lord knows what else. After 7 days, the United States still had the right and the duty to insist on interviewing this person, not allowing the selected journalists, although Les, of course, fine fellow, and all these journalists are fine fellows, but that they are no substitute for the United States government. The government insisted on its right to conduct an interview with this person and failed to achieve that in its own capital. The point is, the United States, having asserted a right and a duty to conduct an interview, then found in its own capital of the United States the Soviet Union saying, I'm sorry, you can't do that. We will make the rules, and we complied with their rules. Nationalize all the loans that our banks have, private loans, the credit to the East Bloc countries, buy them up from the banks at an appropriate discount, perhaps 25 cents on the dollar, and then compel one of their countries to go into bankruptcy. Felix Royton, who's been on this show, a New York investment banker and a leading thinker in the Democratic Party, puts it very cogently. Says they've shot down one of the planes from our side of the world. Let's shoot down one of the countries from their side of the world. We are subsidizing. I'm talking about Poland. We have subsidized the martial law regime. The West not only virtually rescheduled all their debts during martial law, which is a substantial subsidy, but this administration continues to subsidize Poland. The West is giving 6% money, in effect, to Poland, while Americans are paying 12% for mortgages. It's time to make them feel what a materialist can feel, which is material pain. For subsidizing the Soviet Union. But the administration is pathetic when it says that this proves that the president's words have been right all along.
You're right.
We didn't elect a dictionary. We elected a president, and it's time for him to act.
A lot of people,
The state of Ohio, which has a liberal Democratic governor, also has a better foreign policy than the United States has today, because at least they've done something. The fact is we have at hand an enormous strategic weapon called credits. This strategic weapon is in the hands of private bankers today. All loans to the East Bloc should be handled government to government. That strategic weapon of credit should no more be in private hands, and the MX should be run by the Hertz Corporation.
But I said,
Sam, what we heard from our guest this morning was a desire to bring the Allies in. If you try and coordinate this with unanimous Allied support, your sanctions will be set by the weakest member of that coalition, because you'll have to keep modifying them to bring everyone in. The beauty of disrupting the credit mechanisms is our country can do it alone and compel other people to get in line for certain default procedures. But generally, it's a rule.
And they're depositors.
It's a rule of life that banks never suffer. Maybe they should, but they don't, because they have socialized their losses while keeping their profits private. let's just assume the banks get away with
That's
murder.
a nice way to put it.
Well, let's just
Well, they're
assume...
subsidized by the taxpayers,
Well,
right?
well, in the end, certainly. But let's assume that they suffer some losses. The American bankers are into the polls for a far less than the German bankers are, and that's Germany's problem. Let them worry about it.
Well, again, to a degree in this country, there is a very substantial peace movement which is demanding that the American weapons not be installed in Western Europe. And will the heat and fevers and fervor of this movement be reduced by this?
Oh, not a bit. We've already seen their reaction. With the impartiality for which they're justly famous, they have weighed in with the thought that this proves that the Soviet Union is paranoid. It proves, inferentially, that the United States, of course, made them paranoid with our mad arms race. Therefore, to ease the Soviet paranoia, disarmament must begin. It must begin here in the United States.
But how long did it take to think that up, you suppose?
About 30 seconds.
There are two horrible decisions he has to make. Should there be a summit meeting, briefly?
Probably not, and there almost certainly will be.
In this instance, was he more right or more wrong?
Well, Sam, he's wrong, and that is he is accepting the conventional wisdom that grows like grass over at the State Department, which is that the United States cannot, as an empirical fact, and morally should not try to do anything unilaterally, that is, without the concert of our allies. Now, that is, first of all, demonstrably false. The United States can throw a terrific wrench in the machinery of credit flow to the East simply by calling in some of the chits it has by the fact that Poland, to take just one example, is technically in default to the United States government today. We could seriously disrupt the flow of Western credit that is supporting the East Bloc countries. But something terrible follows from this conventional wisdom, Sam, and it is this. If indeed the United States never can, in any circumstance, do anything about the Soviet Union, adopt any policy of leverage or pressure, leave punishment aside, to try and alter and civilize Soviet behavior without the concert of our allies, it means, first, that American policy will always be hostage to the most reluctant member of the alliance, will always, therefore, have the lowest common denominator as its principal component, and second, we are going to have to then radically redefine our estimate of American power, which is going to be, in this world, dealing with the Soviet Union, negligible.
They made the case to reporters that Ronald Reagan has so established his credentials as an anti-communist, a man who has never trusted the Russians and doesn't trust them now, that it wouldn't matter that the American people, even though maybe you, Mr. Lofton, and you, Mr. Wells, say he should have been tougher, won't believe that Ronald Reagan is soft on the Russians. George?
Well, he may get away with it, but what we're not really interested here in the president's inner life. We're interested in his examples and actions as a president. And in that regard, he is not indistinguishable from Jimmy Carter. His response here has been rather less than we got from Jimmy Carter when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. It seems to me a colossal blunder for Schultz now, the very week after this happens, to trot off to Madrid to meet with Gromyko to do I know not what. Constantly we have this. After Afghanistan, after martial law in Poland, there's always some meeting upcoming, and the State Department always prevails with its argument that we must go and scold Mr. Gromyko, who has been scolded by experts and could care less. John, I think an awful lot of conservatives, far too many in my book, are more angry at OSHA than they are at the Soviet Union anyway, and I'm not sure they would pull the lever on an issue such as this. I think most conservatives, and the president understands this, being a very good politician, have nowhere else to go. But the fact is, intensity matters in politics. And if enough of these incidents come along, the flaccid administration response to martial law in Poland and the non-response in this case, then it is going to be hard for conservatives to develop the intensity they felt when they said that it really matters a great deal that we have Ronald Reagan rather than Jimmy Carter.
How serious, and do you see the damage to the U.S.-Soviet relationship as a result of the shooting down by the Soviets of that South Korean airliner?
The damage done to our relations is not nearly serious enough. I mean, there have been no consequences whatever, so far as I can see, except the rhetoric. With this administration dealing with the Soviet Union, you watch their feet, not their mouths, and their mouths are moving, but their feet are not. Nothing has changed. I disagree with my friend Mel. I think there'll be a summit next year. I don't think that this will interfere with that at all. I think what's happened is this. The administration, ideologically opposed to the grain embargo and burned by the difficulties it's had over technology transfer agreements with our allies, has come to what is now the conventional wisdom, the conclusion, false, in fact, and morally repulsive, that there's nothing we can or should do except in concert with our allies. It is not true, and it's a recipe for paralysis of this country as a great power.
What's your recipe?
Is for us to unilaterally begin, as we can unilaterally do, and compel the allies to join with us in doing it simply by the credit mechanisms, begin shutting down the flow of credit from west to east that is sustaining the East Bloc.
And you think
Damaged the Soviets a great deal, and our banks only about as much as they deserve to be damaged after 10 years of reckless lending. If the president really believes, and I'm sure he does, what he said to Jack, then we have to sit back and wonder whether this country, led by such people, can conduct itself and project power around the world as a great power. Because if there is nothing between rhetoric and war, if there are no levers that can be found, no policy of constant pressure and discipline that we can exert on the East Bloc, then it seems to me we are in a terrible position. Now, I just think the president,
Reagan with that's your point?
A failure of leadership that flows from either bad advice or blindness on his part. There are levers at hand. That is a factually false statement. That the president
to compel them.
I am asking him to let circumstances compel them, which I think they would do once the United States simply asserted and acted on the fact. And the fact is Poland is in default and has been while we have been rescheduling their debts through 18 months of martial law. Once the default procedures begin, the lawyers take over, and you get in line, and courts come into effect, and negotiations start, and the allies can't stay out of it. And bankers become very wary about doing what we're doing now, which is lending them money to pay the interest on the loans we've given them to pay off the bad loans.
George, deals with a situation.
Fine, you keep that in mind. You also keep it, we can all say 6 times every morning the Soviet Union exists. It's a small planet, it's round, and I've got all that mastered, Martin. We don't have to subsidize them. That's all I'm saying. But I do not believe that in the myriad relations this country has with the East Bloc, with all the flow of credit and various other subsidies, that someone who knows government and has the will to act on Reaganite rhetoric could not have found the levers to do so. I think ERA is different, but these changes, changing longshoremen to stevedore and things such as this, of course they're cosmetic, and of course they're foolishness, but also the women's movement has been running around for years with documents, as we have a list here, of 700 or 1,200 or whatever, the numbers changed by the 100, of outrageous American laws, and when you open it up, a lot of them were like this. Well, they can't, on the one hand, beat people up for having hundreds of outrageous laws and then get around saying, well, it's merely cosmetic when you take them seriously. I think it's quite legitimate. I agree with Tom for someone to run as an element of ginger in the campaign. He's not going to win, but he doesn't deserve ridicule. His timing was unfortunate because he gave an interview foreshadowing this before the plane was shot down, and it came out after the plane was shot down and contained the really McGovern-esque pearl where he said, this man Andropov seems like a reasonable guy.
How could we nurture it in view of the fact that most politicians pander to constituencies? Evidence the 7 Democratic pretenders before the National Organization for Women.
It is an extraordinary sight, and you're quite right to point to it, that the climate of 1983, as these gentlemen go about the country, is extremely disheartening, because with 1 or 2 exceptions, Fritz Hollings and Askew, I guess, the Democrats seem not just to lack the capacity to say no to anybody, but they lack the capacity to be embarrassed by their behavior. The most extraordinary thing that they can get up and simply outbid one another without even a sense of blush.
On the other hand, I was a bit embarrassed by the president himself because he went over there to Judy Goldsmith. I thought that was an embarrassment. I don't know why he went there and did what he did.
Well, I agree that there are certain constituencies in politics you simply have to write off. And if you write off the National Organization for Women, of course, you're not writing off women, because the National Organization for Women is one of those preposterously named outfits that tries to achieve a kind of political sleight of hand with a grandiloquent label. In fact, most women never heard of it.
Mood in the country that's stronger than ever, that anytime you say anything that, even if, and I don't mean to support James Watt, as a matter of fact, I'm relieved that he's gone, but we've come to the point that one slip of the lip and you're through.
Well, there's no question there's a certain number of people in this country who aren't happy unless they're unhappy. They simply don't feel alive unless they're indignant, and they certainly had the field day with Jim Watt. What struck me as peculiar about this latest controversy about what he said about a woman and a black and 2 Jews and a cripple or whatever it was, that some of the people who got right to, and that is black civil rights organizations that advocate affirmative action and quotas and goals and all the rest, and women's feminist civil rights groups that advocate the same thing should have had the common decency to pipe down about Jim Watt. Because all Watt was doing was, in his jocular way, saying out loud what those people want the government to do, which is sort us out on the basis of skin pigmentation and our chromosomes, and base state action on sex and race. Now, when he said it, it sounded vulgar. Well, it is vulgar, but it's their policy. Honorable. Not how best to do that. Now, conservatives tend to feel, rightly in my judgment, that the greatest anti-poverty program the world has ever seen is called the American economy. And what we have to do are find ways to provide economic growth. We went through a period in the 50s, especially the 60s and 70s, when people said that the key to improving society was not the private generation of wealth, but the redistribution of wealth through state agencies. I think we've outgrown that. Just a little differently, I'd say let's treat Poland as what it is, which is in default. Poland is in default. We are subsidizing it to the benefit of its Soviet overlords. It seems to me we ought to use this not as so much the shooting down of the airline, not so much as a reason for doing this, but as an occasion for doing what we had reason to do anyway, which is using credits as what they are, which are important strategic weapons of national policy.
The Times, the New York Times, has praised the president on two separate occasions, somewhat profusely praised him for showing restraint in the aftermath.
Well, I think the president, frankly, did do himself a lot of political good by his non-response to the Korean airline episode. His response was almost entirely rhetorical, and that it did further dissipate some of the lingering anxiety that people have, both here and abroad, that he is a California extremist. I think that's always been a caricature, and I think perhaps he's gone a bit too far in trying to dissipate it. But I can't deny that I think he's done himself a lot of political good in the last month.
That time, and that is that there was a state of considerable flux of semi-anarchy. There was a demi-government at best that was going around still busy shooting the previous government.
Yes, but that's not what
and
the
we got there
president
just in time to prevent screwing down the lid of a regime that then we couldn't have pried off. Now, I think there are three sufficient reasons, each of them sufficient. Two of them, the weaker ones, I'm glad he used, if only because they carried Tom Wicker in the argument, part way in the argument. But it seems to me that it would have been useful for the president to have said, impolitic perhaps, but over the long haul useful, that the United States considers it a sufficient reason for acting when the Soviet Union is planting yet another military outpost in our front yard.
Well, then that's a sufficient reason to go in and invade Nicaragua. Let's wipe out the Cuban influence, which is undeniable there. And as a matter of fact, as Secretary Haig once said early in the administration, let's go to the source. Let's go to Havana. Why not do it?
I would say that the reasons, if any, for not doing that are entirely prudential and not at all moral. That is to say, the Nicaraguan regime has no moral claim on our tolerance. I think credibility is, to some extent, a seamless web. Let's just suppose that the Eastern Caribbean nations had cried for help, and the United States, where it was easy in our own backyard, and projecting force was no technical problem, had said no. What conclusion would, say, the Saudis have drawn, the Saudi regime, as it watches the ascendancy of Iranian power in their area? In that sense, it seems to me, the believability of America's word was, to some extent, at stake. And you can buy the MX, you can buy all these sophisticated weapon systems. But the most important lesson that could have been given was given by the Grenadian operation, which is that the United States is ready not just to procure expensive weapons, but to use the essential weapon of national security, which is a man with a rifle. The object of war is not good journalism either. The object of war is to win. The object is the safety and success of your men. Now, honorable men and women of goodwill can and now will for months disagree as to whether or not the regulation of journalists was warranted. But I would say that you can't simply strike off the board by incantations of the First Amendment.
I haven't raised it once.
I understand. The right of people charged with life and death decisions to worry about something other than the immediate maximum information flow. Well, I think relations are bad and that bad relations are good, and that this isn't a paradox. That is, bad relations, confrontational, containing, filled with friction, and an utter absence of illusion are good for the United States, whereas good relations with the Soviet Union, when good is taken to mean the relations of détente, the wish being father to the thought about some mellowing of the Soviet system, is bad for the United States because it produces a rank growth of wishful thinking over here. There are hints of that in the 1970s, when the United States went into a protracted retreat, when the United States allowed the illusion of détente to paralyze our procurement process while we subsidized the Soviet Union economically. All I'm endorsing is not the Reagan foreign policy, it's the Truman-Atchison foreign policy of containment. It's the foreign policy of Eisenhower, of Kennedy, who in his inaugural address said, "We must be prepared as a democratic people for the discipline of a long twilight struggle." He didn't wish it away. It was a realistic talk, and 22 years later, I still support it. It was a question about whether what I am envisioning as the United States being a policeman of the world. To some extent, yes. But when there is a burglar of the world, breaking and entering wherever it can, someone has to be the policeman. And our country is stronger, with the collective strength of its allies, much stronger than the burglar. I do not see why the policeman metaphor should terrify us, whereas the burglar metaphor, which is hardly a metaphor, it's a reality, should be taken as inevitable. There's a difference. I wouldn't rule that out. What I'm saying is that we have snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, that the Syrians who, a few months ago, relatively speaking, had suffered a tremendous defeat, now have reason to believe that the forces are shifting in their direction, and until the Syrian army is in some way at risk, no negotiations are possible, and the safety of an American ally, Israel, is in jeopardy.
Well, one place, it's not illegitimate to be timely. Douglas MacArthur once said that all national failure can be reduced to two words: too late. Too late in perceiving dangers, too late in acting on them. There was a narrow window of opportunity here to help restore freedom to Grenada from a group that can really hardly be dignified as a government. If this crowd was a government, Al Capone was a senator. I mean, this is just silly to accord this group that was shooting the last group the status of an established regime. I don't think there's any danger that given a chance, and I think they will be given a chance, the people of Grenada will invite this group back. Is there a case in the history of political cynicism quite to match the record of Fidel Castro, who, having taken a country and run down its economy and made it utterly dependent on huge subventions to keep it afloat from the Soviet Union, has paid for that by selling his young men to go hither and yon to do the violence of the Soviet Empire? And it's the question, what is it supposed to cause people to say? I find unconvincing, I find unconvincing and in fact disingenuous this network's pretense that the point of this movie is to stir a public debate, or, as it says at the end of the movie, inspire a debate among the nations. Well, in the first place, this won't be shown on Moscow television, I have a feeling. Second, what are you supposed to conclude from this? Now, this is ABC's original discovery, that nuclear war would be terrible, for which ABC is to be congratulated. The question is, doesn't this really represent a kind of politics that I'd hoped we'd grown out of with Woodstock in the 1960s? The belief that all our problems are simply wrong feelings, that if we simply were filled with panic, horror, fear, or whatever, we would reason clearly and do something constructive. I do not think ABC or the makers of this movie or the people who are applauding it most have a monopoly on a fear of nuclear war. But it's not a question of good feelings. It's hard politics and strategy that we have to come to grips with. This direction is foolish. No administration of any coloration ought to be in the business of commenting on primetime entertainment of any coloration.
But you see, it's not
They're just going to make a bigger case.
It's on in November because it's the sweeps rating month. Let's face it. Further, I mean, they're going to sell a lot of
George, I don't
beer
think
and
that's
radio
quite.
tires.
I don't think that's quite right.
Then it is a political act.
No,
They're not doing this for ratings.
Fine.
One of the writers of the movie said his purpose was to cause people to question the defense of this country with nuclear weapons.
Well, Jacques,
The Will 9-year-old child will not watch for three reasons. First of all, it would frighten him. Second, I don't believe in dragging children, and I mean people below the age of 16, 17, or 18, into adult political arguments. Third, I'm going to watch Masterpiece Theater. The spirit is right, the target is wrong. That is, the problem there is Syria. Those trucks had to come through Syrian lines loaded. The Syrians had to know about this. Until the Syrian army is put at risk, there can be no progress in the Middle East. Carl, that if Syria achieves its aims, then Western interests are severely damaged. And the Syrians, they're an acquired taste, frankly, right now, that regime, but it does have the virtue of absolute candor. They've said over and over again that Syria, Greater Syria, includes Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, that includes Haifa, as far as Assad is concerned, northern Israel. For that reason, it seems to me, their territorial aims, which are absolutely clear and are being pursued with tremendous vigor and some skill now, have to be frustrated. Until their capital or their army is at risk, they simply have no reason to negotiate. I mean, our position right now seems to be get out or we'll get out, or negotiate or we'll go home. we've got no lever now, no incentive for them to be more forthcoming. I mean, we're dwelling entirely on the question of whether or not Glenn made political headway by saying what he said. Let us note that what he said was true. That is, Mondale started this fight by saying Glenn voted as a mild fiscal conservatism, voted for some of the Reagan programs. Therefore, he's not a real Democrat. But what John Glenn did was say, look, there's another Democratic tradition. He was talking to an organization basically of Scoop Jackson Democrats. He said there's the Roosevelt, Johnson, Truman, Kennedy tradition of strong defense, strong foreign policy Democrats. I support that. I'm not saying I'm Ronald Reagan. I'm a traditional Democrat. And he's saying that Walter Mondale, judged by his votes in the Senate, has a sort of classic liberal left program, which is an America strong enough to defend Israel, period. Message. You see, that I would expect...
That is unilaterally disarmed,
Well, I mean, obviously, I have seen it.
Nuclear war is terrible.
We
knew that,
they have
didn't we?
discovered that nuclear war is terrible. And clearly the people who put the movie together intended it as a political act. One of the people associated with it said, I want people to question, he really wants them to reject, the idea of defending this country with nuclear weapons. Now, I want to see the defense budget he's in favor of, because it's a lot more expensive to defend it otherwise. But since we can't repeal modern physics, much though we would all like to do so, the question is, what is the movie supposed to accomplish? It's supposed to get people very frightened so they will make a demand. What are they supposed to demand?
Freeze, unilateral...
No, it's supposed to be against war.
Wouldn't. The purpose of a retaliation rate is not catharsis, to make us feel better. And it's not justice in the sense that we bring it into an individual courtroom proceeding in this country. And what alarms me about the Secretary of Defense in this is he has brought to the dealings between nations the fastidiousness about due process and about reasonable doubt that makes it look as though the Warren Court were conducting foreign policy, and someone has to go out and read the Miranda rights to the Syrians at this point. It was clear from the start that that attack was impossible without at least the acquiescence and certainly the knowledge of the Syrians. And for that reason, since the problem is to convince the Syrians, not that we're nice, and not that we weren't loved by them, but that their forces are at risk, it has made no sense for the United States to go a month now, almost, I guess, without any retaliation. Yeah, but when arms control talks have proceeded for 15 years now, in conjunction with the principal acceleration in the arms race in human history on the part of the Soviet Union, so I don't think arms talks limit arms. I think, in fact, what you're going to see very soon in 1984 is this president coming to a conclusion other presidents should have come to, and that is that the Soviet Union is in substantial violation of the ABM Treaty, SALT II provisions, and the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. So you're going to find that what we have taken as achievements are really not achievements at all. I maintain that the MX is the point, the ridiculous point almost, to which we were driven by the terms of SALT I. That is, it was arms control that forced us into large MIRV missiles. 3, in ascending order of importance, UN dissolved, UN building made shelter for homeless, or consumption tax passed, deficit to be cut in half, but most important, Orioles sweep series in 4 and repeat. Well, let's leave aside as a dead letter, which it may be, the Logan Act, which says, I think reasonably clearly, that what Mr. Jackson did is illegal. The simple fact remains is there has to be some kind of restraint on what is fair game for exploitation in the admittedly somewhat freewheeling art of self-promotion that is campaigning for president. This is quite clearly a case, I believe, of both exploiting and being exploited. Jesse Jackson has used a crisis of American foreign policy, exploited it for his own political advantage, and he's been exploited. The Syrians have used him first to stick a finger in the eye of the United States government, much, by the way, as Syria's current ally, the Ayatollah Khomeini, did when he released the black hostages, you may recall, during the hostage crisis. Second, Syria, which almost certainly was instrumental in killing 241 Americans with one truck bomb, has gained a tremendous enhancement of its image on the cheap, and almost certainly did this for that reason. So quite clearly also, third, Syria needs a spokesman in the United States, and has found one in Jesse Jackson, who is pleased to suspend his talk about human rights long enough to kiss and be kissed by representatives of a regime that has, shall we say, a blemished record on human rights. Yes, well, the president says you can't quarrel with success. I'll be delighted to quarrel with success. The president, like all the Democratic presidential candidates, seem to be absolutely terrified of Jesse Jackson. I ask you to imagine, just try and imagine what Jesse Jackson would have to do to get one of the Democratic candidates to criticize him. It's quite a spectacle. The Democratic Party, by the way, is, I think, at some risk here, not only because of the obvious terror of the candidates of Mr. Jackson, but also because
Mr. Jackson is going to be a power in that party, and he is, if not quite an enemy of Israel, he certainly is a friend of Israel's enemies.
And?
Well, it seems to me that this is a kind of baggage that the Democratic Party may not quite need. In order to say, Ted, that Jesse Jackson has succeeded where the president has failed is to imply that they have comparable responsibilities and similarly broad and complicated objectives. It simply isn't true. It is a sure crowd pleaser to say at any time that the fate of one American who can be personalized, put on television, made vivid, and his parents and his loved ones televised, that the fate of one man should be the overriding objective. That is not a luxury that a president, to put it plainly, not a luxury that a responsible person can have. Although it's admire the energy with which the ambassador approaches his task of defending the indefensible, which is the Syrian record on human rights. This is germane to our discussion tonight, Ted, because the question is, was this a humanitarian gesture? And if you're going to find a humanitarian gesture here, it helps to find humanitarians. And what I have written in several columns, and I'll be glad to expand upon if the ambassador really thinks it's in his interest, some of the more lurid excesses of the Syrian regime. I got the Syrians unhappy with me recently, by describing a tape of a ceremony in Syria where young girls were biting off the heads of snakes and young men were killing puppies in celebration of the Yom Kippur War. I also mentioned that in one town in Syria, the Assad regime had killed between 20 and 25,000 Syrians. Amnesty International says between 5 and 20,000. I'm willing to take my low estimate or Amnesty International's high estimate. It hardly matters when you're killing in quantities like this.
I'd quarrel with everything. I'd quarrel with your characterization that he talked Assad into it. Well, I don't think anyone talked Assad into it.
What do you think he did?
I think he went over and was useful to Assad. I mean, Assad is, in one way or another, is, I think, responsible for the deaths of a great many Marines. He buys an enormous amount of humanitarian image in this country by releasing one flyer. Jesse Jackson comes back and thanks Assad for not killing Goodman. Says, in fact, at the White House that the Syrians had a right to kill Goodman. Curious construction of international law. And on we go. It seems to me that when the president said you can't quarrel with success, he was saying if all you care about are results in this world, okay, he got the results this time. But if you care about due process in government and the procedures of international relations, which a conservative, Lord knows, ought to, then the president's statement is false, and we all should quarrel. Well, George, I think I'll just suppose candidate A accepts an invitation from Andropov or Andropov's ghost or Andropov's surrogate to go and renew the dialogue. And Democratic candidate B accepts an invitation from Castro to go and renew the dialogue with Castro. And pretty soon you'll have all kinds of people who are not quite like Ramsey Clark. I mean, he, after all, is trivial. But you have people who are main players in the American political process dealing for their purposes and the purposes of our adversaries with our adversaries. It seems to me a very dangerous process.
I agree. Syria wants us out. If all the United States wants at this stage is to be out of Lebanon, there's a congruence of interest, but to call that peace would be a travesty. Certainly to our advantage if you look at the national interest for us to stay there. There are three possibilities. You could say, look, we have no leverage with Syria right now. Syria can read American public opinion and the political dynamism of this campaign. Therefore, the only leverage we have is perhaps Assad's ego. Maybe we can turn him into a Sadat by making a grand gesture, give him a peace prize, have a summit, something. If all you're trying to buy is the decent interval. But look, Martin, we have an absolute congruence of interest if our interest is simply to get our soldiers out, to conduct yet another American retreat under fire. Assad will come down to the beach and strew roses in the path of the Marines. That's not a problem. If, however, we want to continue to shape the Middle East, not least of all by preventing the ascendancy of the radical Syrian regime, then we have to stay there. If you're Jesse Jackson and you have 200 delegates, say, first of all, you're going to find that Mondale, or whoever's won this, doesn't need your delegates. Second, you're going to find out that statutorily, in terms of rights legislation and things that don't cost money, the Democratic Party has given blacks everything they've asked for anyway. And with regard to money, the Democrats know they're out of money. We're not $200 billion close to balancing the budget. So they can't come in with some new extension of the welfare state. The flush on the economy is the flush of fever, and it is not fundamentally healthy. No one ever doubted, Martin, that if you have consumers coming out of a recession, going on a consumption binge, and if you fuel it with $200 billion deficits, that you can have a recovery. The question is, what is the cost in wear and tear and the eventual pain that has to result from this on the economy? I think that you can make an argument from a Republican point of view that the 1984 election would be a great one to lose so you could let the ceiling fall in on the other crowd. Yes, if the president keeps dropping olive branches in front of the Soviet Union, he's going to be arrested for littering. In point of fact, it is an ABM treaty they evidently are violating. It is the threshold test ban treaty they are violating. The amazing thing is that it took so much dynamite to blast this report, even out of a conservative Republican administration, because there's such a vested interest in the American government, the permanent government, by which I mean basically the State Department, in reducing friction, in the illusion of amicability.
What are you for, George?
Some violations by the Soviet Union are so flagrant and contemptuous of our will to call them on it that you can take a picture of them, such as phased array radars that are essential to, and only essential to, an ABM system, which they have forsworn in a treaty that is, like most other undertakings with them, sort of a dead letter when it suits their interests. Issue. From the time of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through the withdrawal of American forces from Indochina, we were spending an average of $46 million a day in Vietnam. The 84-85 figure for money for El Salvador recommended by the Kissinger Commission is 9 days of the Vietnam War. Now that is trivial as preventive medicine, if indeed it works. Will it work? This report is full of nation-building stuff about education and all the rest. All very well. We have, 40-minute flight from Washington is Appalachia. It has received more attention per capita than any part of the country for 20 years now, since Kennedy discovered poverty there during the West Virginia campaign of 1960. There aren't insurgents running around in West Virginia and the back hollows of Kentucky blowing up the power stations and the bridges. Still, we have not figured out how to sort of build Appalachia. The idea that we can do it in the middle of a civil war in Central America passes belief. Among the people whipping this hysteria up, if that's what's going on, are the Democratic candidates who seem to be arguing, A, that relations are terrible, B, that is this administration's fault, and C, that therefore it is incumbent on this administration to find new ways to tempt the Soviet Union back to various bargaining tables. To get some kind of arms control agreement that it's going to retreat from a position held by other administrations with regard to the MBFR talks. That is an insistence on data on manpower deployments from the Soviet Union before manpower agreements, new levels are agreed upon. And people say it's particularly necessary because we now have all this evidence of Soviet cheating. Manpower agreements are very hard to verify. And right now, we say the Soviet Union has 220,000 more forces there than the Soviet Union admits. Are you going to insist on data prior to a manpower agreement? It's a recipe for removing an enormous number of decisions now made by the market and politicizing them.
Putting them in the courts.
Courts in the end will do it. Agencies, tribunals within the government will be making all these decisions. And comparability, as you say, it's a very different leap. It's a quantum jump away from equal. We know if someone's running a lathe and someone else is running a lathe, that's equal work.
Okay, fine,
but if someone's playing shortstop for the Orioles, probably the most important job in America, and someone is, say, a columnist, columnists come and go, they don't particularly matter. What are we going to do?
Less important at shortstops, I guess.
Of course. And what are you going to do? Have an enormous metaphysic of comparability spread across society? I don't know. This formulation of the word problem of disparity. Not all disparities in this world are problems. They often reflect real values, real market forces. And if every time you find an inequality of result in society, you say there's a problem requiring a political solution, you are going to melt the transistors of our political system. It can't generally not. Well, I think a great many Americans, Ted, think that good relations with the Soviet Union are not necessarily frictionless relations. Good relations are realistic relations, and one of the reasons Ronald Reagan was elected, and one of the reasons Mr. Posner was on and probably a bit anxious on November 5th, 1980, is that the American people had looked at détente, had begun the decade of the 70s believing in détente, and had been rudely disabused of their belief in détente by Soviet behavior from the Yemen, Angola, Ethiopia, Yellow Rain, Kampuchea, and all the rest. So I don't believe that the American people are as upset as Mr. Posner says he is over the chill in our relations.
And yet you have just heard, George, two very savvy politicians who do seem to acknowledge that the war and peace issue, the danger of enhanced friction with the Soviet Union may very well be one of the key campaign issues.
Well, it's with great fear and trembling that I disagree with my elders in this regard, but I do disagree. I remember the story, Ted, that in 1960, Dick Nixon was running for president and liked to talk about foreign policy all the time, and finally Governor Stratton of Illinois said to him, "Dick, you can talk all you want about foreign policy,
But on election day, it's the price of hogs in St. Louis that matters most. The bread and butter issues in this country are the price of bread and butter. In 1968, when we were fighting a ground war of attrition on the mainland of Asia for ill-defined purposes with a conscript army, even in 1968, it's not clear that foreign policy was the election-turning issue. Very bad autumn for the Soviet government, for which Mr. Posner is a spokesman. And I don't think, although Mr. Reagan might in one particular want to take credit for it, I don't think he can. First, there was the Korean Airlines massacre. Then there was the failure this year, culminating in the vote in the Bundestag on November 22nd, of the Soviet Union to influence the electorates of the United Kingdom and Britain against the deployment of the NATO missiles, continuing, by the way, a Jimmy Carter two-track policy. And finally, there was, after the vote in the Bundestag, the Soviet Union walking away from the table. Now, I don't believe this represents the Reagan administration controlling events. It reflects a failure of the Soviet Union to control events. I can't understand what Mr. Stoba finds objectionable, frankly. As the clouds were lowering over Poland, this president lifted the grain embargo. When martial law was declared, this president did nothing to withdraw the credits given to Poland. When the Korean Airlines massacre occurred, this president took about 4 hours to declare that there was virtually nothing he could do. In the theater nuclear force talks, this president proposed 0, and then he proposed any number. Let the Soviet Union pick any equal number of warheads. In the START talks, he has proposed force levels substantially below those of SALT II. I'm quite frankly, Ted, flabbergasted as to what he would have to do to dispel the myth of his bellicosity.
But do you agree with what most people here seem to be saying this evening, and that is until after the election there probably won't be U.S.-Soviet talks?
There won't be, and then afterwards we'll continue with the sterile exercise that is arms control until the Soviet Union shows some evidence that it has hitherto not shown of being interested in arms control.
George?
People losing their tempers, and a little honest passion. No, it's the case that I think Murray Kempton once said that the absence of honest passion is the characteristic of professional wrestling. And it's also the characteristic of our politics too often. Now, Schultz is a man who feels strongly, feels he's been abused, feels the national interest is being jeopardized. Say so at the top of your lungs now and again. Doesn't hurt anybody.
Well, the question is, was the national interest jeopardized?
Yes.
So I think...
I'm laughing because I'm the original hardliner on the embassy question. For years I've said it ought to be located in East Jerusalem to make the point that the city is unified forever. And it is marvelous to watch the dialectic of an American campaign produce in two perfectly sensible men this reflex to pander as they hit the New York primary. I mean, they'll forget about this as soon as they leave New York. Morton Kondracki of the New Republic was traveling the Hart.
You got a new idea?
Well, listen to it. He said, in an interview aboard his campaign plane, Hart said, I don't know if this is public information, but in the basement of his presidential palace, Somoza, in Nicaragua, kept cages with panthers inside. After dinner, for the entertainment of his guests, he would go downstairs and have a political opponent thrown in there with the panthers. And that's a pretty bizarre thing to believe, particularly because no one, not even the Sandinistas, think it's true.
Everyone has denied it, even his enemies.
That's right.
Apparently,
well, Somoza did some pretty rotten things. If he didn't throw people to panda,
now,
he killed them in other ways.
Wait a minute. It is important, and this is why I like our political process, untidy as democracy and messy as life itself, because it gives lots of people a chance to say things that cause people to sit bolt upright and say, what kind of people believe this sort of thing?
You say, should Jerusalem be the capital of Israel? Jerusalem, Martin, is the capital of Israel. There's no question about that. And moving the embassy there would have the good effect of saying a united Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is off the negotiating agenda. Let's just not kid ourselves. And it is off the negotiating agenda. The Secretary of State, in his letter opposing the Moynihan bill, raises 4 points, one of which is a good one. That is, should Congress be intervening in foreign policy in this way? That's a fair question. But his others, he says, it will make negotiations difficult. No one wants to negotiate with Israel. They haven't, with the exception of Egypt, for eons. They say it will offend the moderate Arabs. Name one. King Hussein, who's been doing all this insulting behavior to the United States recently. And worst of all is the talk from the State Department that if we move our embassy, there will be mobs in the streets of other cities, and they can't guarantee the safety of our embassies. There would be no Reagan administration if the previous administration had not been so ham-handed and ineffective in dealing with an embassy and a mob in the Middle East. The full interest the United States has anywhere in the world is to convince people that it can identify its friends and stand by them. If you open up the telephone directory of the United States State Department and look at page 167, it says, country Israel, post Tel Aviv, country Jerusalem. We treat it as a country.
Capital Jerusalem.
It says country. It's listed as a country. Now, when you're driven to such semantic incoherence by a policy, the policy's wrong.
George, how are you?
There was a much too dismissive attitude about Mondale, and I think the Republicans, if they dismiss Mondale and the United Democratic Party as opponents this fall, may be unemployed.
Well, given the chances on the evidence of the Democratic presidential campaign this year that the chance for a bipartisan foreign policy was nil to begin with, this did not reduce that chance very much. And I'll do many things for my country, but I will not sit on television and pretend that it does not take a micrometer of extreme precision to tell the difference between Mondale and Hart on these issues. It comes down, as I recall, they got in this bidding war last week to see who could promise to withdraw more thoroughly, more quickly from more places. And the difference came down to someone would leave something, Mondale, I guess, in Honduras, of all places. The issue is not fighting. The issue is the deployment of forces, the giving of commitments, the sending of military aid. And on all of these, the Democratic Party, bewildered by its inability to come up with a domestic agenda for a time of permanent fiscal scarcity, is emphasizing exclusively foreign policy and simply the routine of cutting back American projections. To that extent, I don't see how you can disagree with what Hugh says.
Not that group, anyway.
Martin, look, we're talking about the kind of Democrats who participate in primaries. It's been well said that the old isolationism, the Republican isolationism of the 20s and 30s, was the belief that the United States was too good for the world. The Democratic isolationism, the McGovernite version, is that the world is too good for the United States, that whenever the United States gets involved, it's to prop up dictators, it's to intervene against the tide of history and all the rest. That's a clear strain.
Very graceful phrase. However, also totally inaccurate. Let me remind you.
But there's a mildly amusing aspect of this otherwise degrading spectacle, and that is that people are now exercised because Farrakhan threatened a journalist. Now the journalists are all in an uproar. About 6 weeks ago, as I recall, Jackson stood on a stage with this man, and this man clearly threatened Jews as a group. Jackson didn't step forward and say that's disgusting, which it was, and there was no proper outrage at that time.
Well, in his speech this week to the Trilateral Commission, Secretary Schultz said that there is now a view in Congress and elsewhere that the aim of American foreign policy is to restrain United States action. I think there is some of that. However, this administration is, to me, singularly unconvincing when it complains about the War Powers Act, because the War Powers Act, if it is a constitutional infringement, is open to constitutional attack, and they should have rushed to the Supreme Court to do it. And I can hardly wait till that happens. Well, votes, Martin, which were a mixture, an astonishing mixture of cynicism and hysteria, were, I think, almost unintelligible and certainly indefensible, because the mining of the harbors is carrying out the policy that the Congress has endorsed by supporting repeatedly, after much briefings, the war against the Sandinista regime. Well, this is why I say it's an almost unintelligible vote. The Congress has said, after much debate, that this so-called secret war that we read about every day on page 1 of all our newspapers would be funded by the United States Congress. So the question is, why do they say it's all right to fund the war but object to this tactics? The mines that we're using, Martin, are a low-violence approach to a high-violence regime. First place, the reason Nicaragua is howling so much about them is they're effective. They're effective without a lot of bloodshed. 5 ships have hit them. No ship has been sunk. I'm not sure of that, and I'm pretty sure of that. 10 ships have hit them. Okay, fine. None have been sunk. I'm not sure anyone has been killed. They're having an effect. What is the matter with this tactic that causes Congress to fund the war and dislike this tactic?
You're here for that the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran will carry through his threat to mine the Straits of Hormuz. How do you think we'd react to that?
I think we'd open the international waterways. The question here is, well, in the first place, we're putting these, as I understand it, not in international waters, but in Nicaragua's waters. Second, the point is to dissuade Nicaragua from exporting violence to other countries. We are not mainly concerned with the civic hygiene of the Sandinista regime. Well, it seems to me, I think it would be irresponsible for any American president when he has made a judgment, as this one has, and as the Congress has, that United States security is directly involved in events of Central America, to cede responsibility for basic decisions affecting our national security to a court notorious for not being very much relied on, a court the jurisdiction of which has never been accepted by the Soviet Union or its satellites, a court that I dare say you haven't thought about for a number of months. Americans go weeks on end without thinking of the World Court, and now all of a sudden we're supposed to be head over heels in love with the idea.
George,
First of all, I'm not particularly concerned, or certainly not primarily concerned, with America's standing in what is smilingly called world opinion. I question not only the efficacy and indeed the ethics of allowing and technically irresponsible bodies such as the World Court to make vital decisions, but I also question whether the idea of law, international law, is more than a fiction or a metaphor in this context. International law.
Submit in the Carter administration the attack on the embassy to the World Court.
Because it was a way of avoiding taking any serious action.
When we think our security is being threatened, that is a fundamental issue. Does the United States have a right to say we are sovereign over everything we perceive if you Mexicans do something that we say threatens us, if you Canadians do something, if you Brazilians, if you in Nicaragua? I think that this is an outrageous assumption. It is such a copy of the Soviet Union and Poland and Afghanistan that it makes me want to throw up, really.
Well, before you throw up in living color in their living room, you are a pyromaniac in a field of straw men. That simply is not the argument that has been made here.
Where do you end this right to assert U.S. authority then? Only in Nicaragua? Where are you going to end it?
We lived with the Monroe Doctrine for 150 years, and until recently we have accepted it. There hasn't been any great...
This hemisphere is special. Now, that is the radical assertion of this administration and all previous administrations.
Well, why don't you accept that the Soviet Union can say the same thing in Eastern Europe or wherever it intends to follow policy?
Because what the Soviet Union is saying in Poland is that the people of Poland cannot choose their governments. What we are saying in Central America is that the Sandinistas cannot choose governments for other countries.
So saying that the people of Nicaragua, if they want to have a communist government, let us say, are not entitled to have it.
Well, now, the people of Nicaragua haven't been asked, have they, Martin? The Declaration of Independence committed us at our founding to a decent respect for the opinion of mankind, which implies that there is, as indeed there is, an indecent respect. And an indecent respect is a fawning willingness to suspend all the hard judgments to please the Swedes. Our first act with regard to the Sandinistas was to help topple Somoza. Our second act with regard to the Sandinistas was to send them millions of dollars. Now, having failed at that, it seems to me they've earned a few mines in their harbors. Not as long as I have a fountain pen will it cease to be a divisive issue. This is the last of the Taiwan lobby sitting here, I guess. But I think if you look at what the president's doing, suppose you're Walter Mondale, and you've got to go off to Fresno and El Paso and fight this out with Hart. Look what the president's doing. He's going to China, going to drop back through Alaska, and presto, he's going to meet the Pope, the Vicar of Christ in Fairbanks, Alaska. Then he's going to go to Normandy. Then he's going to go to London to the summit conference. He's going to hit Ireland somewhere in here. Then he's going to come back and go to the opening of the Olympic Games in Los Angeles. This is the longest photo opportunity anyone ever put together. Well, there are two tests, at least, of whether it's racially discriminatory. One is it racially motivated? B, does it have an effect that impacts unduly on one race? And an effects test really won't do to establish that it is illegal. Jackson's point is a black person running wins with 40% the first runoff. All but one white person is out, and the white person wins the second time around. But a lot of Southerners say that's not how it will work. What you'll get is white extremists perhaps winning, or, heaven forfend, they say Republicans winning in the South, because the runoff primary tends to force people to appeal for a majority and hence to be a moderating influence. It is a curious one, because he is now saying that the civil rights cause is incompatible with majority rule. But Getty considered them a bother considerably before that, Sandy. Woodrow Wilson certainly found that the Senate, the little band of evil men, I believe he called Senator Lodge and his friends, quite a bother when he was trying to ratify the League of Nations. And that's one of the fascinating things about the argument in this century, Sandy, is that conservatism and liberalism have turned themselves inside out. Between the wars, when an isolationist Congress and some fractious committees such as the Nye Committee were restraining Franklin Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, liberalism, which tended to identify the modern presidency with the liberal force, and certainly Wilson, Roosevelt, and both Roosevelts were sort of interventionist, internationalist presidents, tended to say Congress ought to pipe down and let the president, the only official with a national mandate, speak for the nation. And after the war, when it was Burke Hickenlooper and McCarran and Joe McCarthy and others who were interfering with the likes of Dean Acheson, you heard much the same thing. But then when it became Nixon and Reagan, and it became McGovern and Hatfield and others, Liberalism changed its tune, and so did conservatism. Conservatives now say it's time for Congress to pipe down. It all depends on whose policies are being gored. I don't know that it's run amok with it, Sandy. It seems to me almost all American presidents, and certainly all the presidents commonly considered great, have used American force in ways that, for example, would violate the spirit and perhaps the letters of the War Powers Act today. Perhaps politics starts at the water's edge when you have a kind of permanent fiscal austerity staring you in the face as we do now. No one wants to make his name in Congress by capping Medicare, limiting Social Security, and raising taxes. Those are the kind of choices we now face. It's much more fun to make your name keeping America out of wars, limiting arms sales, going to the Senate press gallery, and getting on television in the surest possible way, which is by taking on a foreign policy question.
Well, Mondale had this, as a senator, helped write all these laws enforcing what they then took to be political hygiene in the country.
He and Ted Kennedy wrote.
All those guys did it. And now he has, if not broken them, he sure bent them in a sort of pretzel-like way, saying, all right, we have limits on how much we can spend, but we'll have these independent so-called delegate committees that can spend money on my behalf without bumping up against the limits or counting against my totals.
It's legal.
Well, it is legal, but these are the same people who say Ed Meese may not have broken the law, but the perception, and it's all kind of sleazy, and the spirit of the laws and all this stuff. Since sleazy and unfair are the two favorite Democratic words when describing the Reagan administration, it doesn't strengthen their case when Hart has to say, essentially, that this is a sleazy and unfair campaign that Mondale's run.
Well, let me ask you, was it sleazy, what Mondale has done?
Well, I have so little sympathy for the silly laws he helped to write that I'm not very indignant when he does these little twists and turns to get around them. But I certainly think that the spirit of that law has been broken by him.
Well, that's George. I think they did it because, A, they think there'll be defections, B, they know we won't do what they did in Moscow in 1980, which is round up anyone who might protest and expel them from the city of Los Angeles. Further, they believe in reciprocity. They're paying us back for 1980. But beyond that, there's the simple miscalculation they believe, as some Americans mistakenly believe, that this will hurt Ronald Reagan. In fact, I don't think it will.
Partly in jest, I'm going to quote a Chicago Tribune sports columnist who said that indeed he thought what they really feared was that somebody would try to sell their athletes real estate out there, or they would see women without mustaches and they'd never go home.
It's an unfortunate, characteristically clumsy attempt to intrude into our campaign. I don't think Americans are going to pull the lever on this issue. But there is a kind of mentality in this country, and I'm sad to say that I think a bit of it came out of Gary Hart this week, that says if the Soviet Union is unhappy, it's America's fault, and it is incumbent upon the Americans to do something to make the Russians happy. In fact, the Russians, when you ask them what specifically have we done, they can only point to one thing, and that is they sent as their Olympic attaché to Los Angeles a KGB agent. And we said, no, try again. That's not right. But beyond that, they simply have no complaint they can point to, which does suggest that they probably made the decision in 1980.
But quite a dramatic change in that.
Look what happens, Carl, when you start saying, well, what can we do to fix this? People start coming close to suggesting, well, maybe we can help guarantee that their athletes can't escape.
No.
Let's just note that the Russians often do things in pairs. They do something to raise enough dust and ruckus that people won't pay attention to something else they're doing. This comes coincident with the reports reaching the West about the increased tormenting of the Sakharovs, husband and wife. Now, that is evidence, small, redundant evidence, that we are dealing with, if I may coin a phrase, an evil empire that is the focus of evil in the modern world. And it's well to bear that in mind when we get panicked over the fact that they may not come. If there's anything more disgusting than all the uproar about how to get the Russians back in the Olympics, it's the apotheosis of Richard Nixon and all this. It seems to me he has a fairly clear program to discredit every president who comes after him. I think it does, but first you have to win the war. I mean, we have put them through their paces. We have had several elections down there. We have certification. We have evidently intruded heavily, and I don't hear the usual people complaining about this. The CIA has intruded itself heavily in their electoral process down there. Now they have a kind of they have an elected government. And again, the question is, are we going to give just enough to have a protracted failure? Right, again, giving the statistics. And I want to join you. I think he's been very statesmanlike. Let's just give his numbers. The numbers involved in this vote yesterday, the sums of money, are 5% of what the Soviet Union is spending in the region down there each year, and 0.1% of the United States military budget. It's trivial.
Supreme Court has voted unanimously that the U.S. ought to stop mining the harbors of Nicaragua and doing some things we've been doing to...
We won't, and what they're doing is making themselves the enforcers of the Brezhnev doctrine and should be ignored. My point is that there really have to be some limits, I'm afraid, to the use of national controversies for the promotion of political campaigns. Now, I can understand the temptation here. Every political candidate has an eye for the main chance, and political life in the United States is increasingly an endless series of photo opportunities, and the Soviet embassy on 16th Street makes a nice backdrop. But there simply have to be limits to this, and one has to say, why are we in such a panic to get the Soviet Union back into this? We're constantly hearing it said that the United States began the process of the heavy intrusion of politics into the Olympics with the 1980 boycott. I'd like to, I guess, to ask Reverend Jackson if, since he believes in dialogue with all these nations and the young people playing together, if he would like to repeal the ban on the South African teams.
Well, I think that the South African relationship, given the present predicament, must remain what it is. A nation that has an efficient law of apartheid and racial oppression, we must chastise them with economic confrontation as opposed to violent confrontation. Our nation, of course, is not honoring any kind of boycott against South Africa, that being its number one trading partner. And I think that the conduct between this nation and the Soviet Union, two superpowers, to talk about South Africa at this point is almost diversionary.
It's not diversionary if it indicates that people have powerful but curiously selective indignations. In point of fact, in the scale of human tyranny, the Soviet Union is rather worse than South Africa. I deplore and detest the South African regime, but to compare as a spreader of human misery, South Africa and the Soviet Union is simply ludicrous. All right, I do. In the first place, I'm hard put to detect any risk that Mr. Jackson is taking. Only risk is winding up late at night on national television. Look at the dialectic that starts once you say, let's, the United States, by our initiative, try and please the Soviet Union. We wind up with a civil rights leader in the United States, yourself, saying we must not induce people to defect. Well, my goodness, I should think the sight of Malibu would be quite inducement enough if you're from the Soviet Union. You say, well, we must be careful about the protests. You made your name in American life by leading vigorous protests against the United States and real injustices that existed in the United States law. Yet you become very curiously decorous in talking about Andrei Sakharov and Afghanistan in their presence. Well, when you talk about pretexts, the Soviet Union has had to search high and low to find a pretext for not coming to these Olympics. It's clear, it seems to me, that they have only one concrete grievance they can turn to, and that is the United States refused to accept as their Olympic attaché someone that we have quite good reason to believe is a KGB agent. I don't see that it is humane to base national security policy and lots of other policies on the blind faith, and it is no more, that dialogue somehow can dissolve the enormities of the Soviet regime. All through the 1930s, it was commonly said, if we just got to understand our adversaries, at that point, the Third Reich and the dictators, got to mutual understanding would solve these problems. Once we understood them, we saw that we had to stop talking and start buying battleships. The Olympics, like the United Nations, actually, often replicate and even often magnify the hostilities in the world. Go back to 1908, the American team wouldn't dip the flag to the King of England. 1956, the pool for water polo ran red with blood when the Russians played the Hungarians. There was a massacre in 1972 at Munich. The belief that games can be isolated from, as Jesse Jackson would say, the political context is, I think, naive.